Of all of the things that I have talked about, all the political issues over the last 6 years, there is truly only one that is for real bipartisan, where the right and the left feel exactly as strongly about it, and it is civics education.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Carabel, the founder of the Progress Network, joined as always by Emma Varvalukas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And What Could Go Right is our weekly podcast where we focus on issues that we believe to be important and hope that you concur. And we talk to scintillating, interesting people, at least we hope they are both scintillating and interesting, about said issues. And one of the things that is surprisingly and suddenly germane this year is a term and an idea that many people of a certain age think of as dry, antiquated, and frankly uninteresting. And that is civics, the study of and the awareness of what governmental systems we in the United States live with, and I suppose to some degree live under. And it used to be that there was civics education as a required aspect of a education that you had to, in order to graduate high school, have one course that taught you about the constitutional framework of the United States, how laws are made, how governments exist, how state governments exist, and how they evolved. And that has waned as a focus to the point where not as many people are exposed to that knowledge. Interestingly, anyone who has to be naturalized as an American citizen and take a citizenship test is exposed to that because they have to learn civics in order to pass that test. So you have this odd system now where anybody who is a recent or not so recent immigrant to the United States may in fact know more about the constitutional system in the United States than many native born Americans. So, we're going to talk to somebody today who has been focusing on and has created a podcast dedicated to this topic and dedicated to civics knowledge and civics education. And particularly as we debate the role of the presidency and the role of the Congress and the role of law and the role of the Supreme Court, this framework and understanding becomes ever more important. So, Emma, who are we going to talk to today?
Today, we are talking to Nick Capodice. He is the co host and education outreach producer of a podcast called Civics 101. Basically, the podcasts exist to help make civics accessible and invigorating for listeners nationwide, with a special focus on young people. They have an archive of something like 400 podcast episodes. So, if you're interested in learning about basically anything civics, especially now with a lot of this debate going on in the first 6 months or so of the Trump administration, it's a great resource to turn to.
Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Nick Capodice, it is such a pleasure to have you on What Could Go Right. Now you get to be on the other side of the microphone, given that you do your own podcast. So you get to, it's like being the dentist in the dentist chair kind of thing, and equally unpredictable and possibly just as painful. I am going to begin with a question that is ripped from the headlines. Big controversy at Texas A&M over a student who objected to the teaching of a like non-binary LGBTQ lesson, and the attention was entirely on, whether he was unfairly being taught this after the Trump administration had done a bunch of executive orders about ending DEI and a variety of other programs, and it led to a big kerfluffle at Texas A&M. And what I'm struck by, apropos our conversation and your work on civics, is that he began his complaint to the teacher saying this lesson is against the president's laws.
Oh, dear.
And what I was struck by was we ought to be talking about that statement in terms of civics far more than we should be debating whether or not it's appropriate or inappropriate or okay or inokay to, is non-binary a category. Please, for the audience here, I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying rather than focusing on that aspect of this particular controversy, what I was struck by was how little we focused on that first statement. So I am going to, rather than preclude what I'm about to say and I'm going to ask you to explain to our listeners why that statement is a civics problem.
It's a big civics problem. It's, I would argue, the biggest civics problem right now because for anybody out there, the president does not make laws. Congress makes laws. That's their purpose. The president does executive orders and executive actions, but those do not have the force of law. If I could just start explaining this with like the briefest of anecdotes. We're doing a thing at Civics 101. We're watching movies every other weekend that are sort of civic themed and having a big conversation after the film in the cinema. And we watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington last Saturday, right? Great film, Capricorn. I love it. I sobbed 50% of the time.
Best filibuster scene in any movie ever. Not that there are so many, but,
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
is it the only?
Oh,
What
no,
No,
are
no.
the
there
What's
other
are
cool
some
about it,
films?
others. I'm sure we could Google ChatGPT.
best filibuster. But instead of reading Green Eggs and Ham, he is expounding on the virtues of democracy, right, which is great, So it's a good filibuster. But the point is the word the president is said exactly one time in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The president is never mentioned, it's never a thought. There's no relationship between the Senate and the president. And that just struck me as how far we've come to the point where so much power in terms of executive action is enacted by the current president of the United States. But yeah, it's a civics problem where we, perhaps due to a lack of understanding or perhaps due to something else, but we're at a point where we interpret the powers of the executive branch as being they've been taken away from Congress and invested in that body. So yeah, it's a big civics problem.
I'm fully prepared to believe that the student who said this believing that, meaning there had been no prior civics education and certainly nothing in the way news, quote unquote, is reported that would lead anyone in particular who didn't know otherwise to believe that the president doesn't make laws. Like that should be obvious, but I don't actually believe it to be obvious. So what's your experience been actually talking to students about what their kind of in the ether understanding is of how systems work, how our constitutional systems work?
Yeah. So the reason our show was created was in the wake of the 2016 election, there was a just swath of people asking questions about can the president do X or can Congress do Y or what's the difference between the House and the Senate? And somebody wrote on a piece of paper, Schoolhouse Rock for Adults. That's how Civics 101 was born.
Emma, you don't remember Schoolhouse Rock.
I vaguely know the reference, like singing, right? They were singing. There was
Cartoons.
rocking. There
Cartoons.
was
There was a
cartooning.
bill who was very, very sad on the steps of the Capitol Hill.
I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill.
I'm too young for this. I'm gonna bow out of this conversation.
There was one about no kings, and there was one about, that's the one thing we stand for, interestingly enough. But the point is, a lot of people, when you talk to people in their 50s and 60s, remember having a rather robust civics education. And almost without exception, it is like, this was so boring. It was my least favorite class, but I did learn how a bill becomes a law. What has happened since then? I believe it was in 2016. No, it was 2017. So for every $50 that the United States spent on STEM education per student per year. Federal government spends 50 bucks per kid per year on science, technology, engineering, and math, right? And for every American student for civics, it's 5 cents. $50, 5 cents. In 2020, that number has been just massively exploded to 50 cents per student per year.
10x.
But it has results. I don't know if you folks are familiar. There's this fantastic study called the Annenberg Civics Survey. It comes out every year. It's like, how are we doing? Like, how am I doing as a nation when it comes to civics understanding? It just came out 3 or 4, a couple days ago, and the results were a market increase in our understanding of civic concepts and procedures and systems by about 5%. The basic one is, can you name all 3 branches of the US government? Last year, 70% of Americans could. This year, 75% of Americans could. That's a big jump. Same survey had the most staggering gap I have ever seen in the history of this survey. And do you trust in the powers and systems of the Supreme Court of the United States? Staggering. It's a 60-point shift. If someone was identified as a Democrat, 18% said they trusted the Supreme Court of the United States versus 75% of Republicans. So these are 2 things combined, right? You have a staggering lack of funding for civics education in the United States, and it has gone down since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, combined with a steepest rise in polarization we've seen in our lifetimes. And those 2 things combined are a perfect storm for someone to say the president's laws. That's what's happening right now.
Might depress you both to know that I had a civics class in high school that was optional, and I did not take it. So I don't know
That's
many
all
people who
right.
did.
I don't think I would have in high school.
I can name all 3 branches of government, though.
Well done. My love and understanding of civics truly went from 0 to 1,000 since starting on the show 7 years ago. Like, now it's everything I think about, and we go to events every month to talk to teachers and, big civic thinkers are like, "What do we do now?" But yeah, it's also the but we talk to a lot of teachers, right? So I like to think about what the teachers are going through right now. The teachers in the US are having, I won't speak for any of them in particular, I won't name any names, but a hard time in navigating this and navigating how to deal with the administration of their school and the parents of, let's say, 90 kids all at the same time, and trying to make everything okay so they don't get a call from a parent and get punished for it. It's one of the toughest times I've ever seen for social studies and civics teachers in the country.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a tough environment. Especially, I think the parents are more involved now than ever, even in stuff that doesn't have to do with politics. So, Nick, I wanted to ask you about. I mean, we're the What Could Go Right people, so we're totally here to celebrate the 5% increase in Americans who can name the 3 branches of government. The other way to look at that is like, okay, 70 to 75% of Americans can name the 3 branches of government, which is like the most basic question. That kind of sucks. Probably most of us, if we took the citizenship test as citizens already, would fail. Voter turnout is pretty low, right? Like we had
Mm,
record high voter turnout in the last, let's say, couple of elections. It was 65%. So, and that hasn't been a recent thing, right? Like that's been throughout American history. Voter turnout has been around that or less. I'm wondering if you could talk about the relationship between those two things, both civics education and voter turnout, and also if you have any working theory for why like Americans suck so hard at both of these things.
yeah. No, absolutely. I really do. So why are we so bad at civics education, and why are we so bad at voting? And do those two things go hand in hand? I think they absolutely do. However, I will say, specifically for younger people, that's who I'm focusing on right now. Why is that demographic of 18 to 25-year-olds so bad at voting? I absolutely understand it. It's not apathy. It's just if it's a feeling that the game is rigged and that they have no say in it. So many young people I talk to say, "Why should I bother voting?" Right? And sometimes they'll say the parties are the same, but that's much more rare now than it used to be. What I always like to tell those students is the reason you feel unrepresented in your elected officials is because you don't vote, and because you're not a guaranteed, slate that they can appeal to over and over again. What's the use of appealing to somebody if they don't vote for you, right? So we always like to say that doing votes is like doing push-ups for your generation, right? You're like trying to like strengthen it up and to have elected officials actually care about you because you'll vote for them. It's one of the strongest things you can do. Another thing though is, so if we look at the Constitution of the United States, what is it? We're at the 250th anniversary of the United States, the Declaration of Independence. About 239 years since the Constitution came. We just had Constitution Day. So we're 250 years into our nation, 250th anniversary of the United States and the Declaration, and the Constitution 230 odd years since our Constitution was written. What we have seen as a country with the oldest surviving continuing Constitution in the world is that it has been interpreted and adapted so many different ways over these 200 odd years that it gets to a point where you feel like whomever has the most money and whoever has the best lawyers is going to be right. You look at things like precedent, look at 100-year-old precedent set by the Supreme Court, and that just is overturned in the blink of an eye. You can be like, well, it doesn't matter. All these rules don't matter if the people who are in power can do whatever they like with those rules. Of course, I would feel cynical and I would feel a little apathetic, perhaps, if you just see this happen over and over again. A tremendous example of this is the upswing in the shadow docket, which we just did an episode on for Civics 101. These are Supreme Court orders that are not typical. There's no briefs, there's no arguments, there's no great opinion that you get to read and sort of simmer over and, in the summer. This is, the Supreme Court just saying, "Yep, uphold this, don't uphold that." We're in the fall and we have had a record. This has been a world record in shadow docket decisions by a court in US history. So I can see both sides of it. I can see this lack of civics education mixed with an apathy, with a feeling that what you do doesn't matter, and with a feeling that the rules are not being followed.
It's odd. We've actually done, I think, 2.5 episodes of this season have been on the shadow docket or aspects of it. One with Jeffrey Rosen, who's the head of the National Constitution Center. The other,
I met Jeffrey Rosen last week. I hung out with him just a few days ago. He's phenomenal.
yeah, so we did a podcast with him. We did one with Stephen Vladek, who's a Georgetown professor, and we did one with Joyce Vance, who was a former U.S. attorney, and we talked about. So it's indicative of our time that we are all talking about something that we didn't talk about at all ever
I
before.
never, yeah, my entire youth, I never would have known what the shadow docket was or what, emergency injunctions were. But now we're all talking about it.
Yeah, things change. Like, it's easy to do the conversation as we are now doing it, which is to lament the legitimate lack of civic education, the fact that Emma made a horrifically wrong choice in her high school career, and which she has ameliorated with her autodidact self-corrective mechanism. But that being said,
We can hope.
most of us don't do that, and then promptly left the United States, which is a whole other issue. So, what are the good stories here of people being exposed to civic education or having, I guess the question is the nature nurture, right? It may be a problem that there isn't civic education, but that doesn't mean there isn't kind of ingrained community history, civic sensibility. And you pointed
Sure.
to this is the longest constitutional system, right? That the United States is this conundrum of it's a young country in an old state or a young country in an old system. And that does work its way into people's sensibilities, right? I imagine if you gather together, I imagine being the softball leading question for you who does indeed gather together a group of high school students, that many of them have civic sensibility that they've kind of imbibed in the ether.
Mhm.
And I'm
Yeah.
wondering like what the good stories are there as opposed to the oh my god stories, which constitute the bulk of our written and spoken stories, but are probably not the bulk of the actual stories.
That's a really good point, and we always gotta start with the "Oh my god," right? We just gotta get it out of the way. It's like taking the medicine. I would say the successes far outweigh the negatives in terms of what we see with students across the country. The first thing is that civics, when we say civics, I have lately been thinking we need to get a new word for it because when we hear civics, all this baggage comes with it. It's the thing that Emma did not want to do in high school, right? We did
So
not want
boring.
so boring. What civics is, there's this wonderful teacher, Raj Vinakoda, who has been advocating across the country. Civics is not the legislative process and it's not executive actions. It is learning in second grade that you have had a turn and you must give the toy to the other kid. That is the foundation of civics, and it is everything. And it's not how to debate necessarily, because debates have winners and losers. Civics is how do I talk to you, Emma? How do I talk to you, Zachary? How do we do it in a way that is like kind and we can listen to each other's points of view and we can disagree. Right now, being able to disagree, I think, is the big problem in the United States now. So students are learning how to disagree with each other in most places, and they're using tools that I don't see in people my age, sitting at the bar and whatever state I happen to be in at any given time. Arguing is not happening, I think, in a really good way among people in my demographic, but it seems to be doing really well in students because teachers are enforcing these very good rules about how do we disagree with other classmates. And that's what civics is. We are a nation born out of revolution and disagreement. That's what we are. We're I was going to say we're a Tea Party nation, but that was going to come out the wrong way. But we're a nation from protest, and we're a nation where people disagreed to create how we operate. And once that disagreement is gone, I believe the spirit of the nation is gone. So you'll have some people calling it civil discourse. That's like the thing that we need to start doing. And you'll have some people calling it just talking. But I think that is what right now, as in like, the last few months in the United States, is going to be the sort of central focus, which is not as much processes and much more how can we get back to disagreeing again.
What does that look like for you or maybe for these students on the ground? Because I feel like my personal anecdote about this is that I was trying to actively, like, quote unquote, depolarize myself for years. And I thought that I was doing a pretty good job. And then I started dating somebody who the only vote he's ever cast in his life was for Trump in 2016. And, like, I was just shouting at him most of the time, right? Like, I was
Ooh.
not depolarized at all. Like, it was I was
Well,
super reactive.
what were you arguing about?
We argued a lot about the fact that he had never voted except for Trump. We argued about a lot of the, like, culture war issues, like, he's ex-military, and he really felt that the military had gone, quote, unquote, "woke" under Obama, and that there was a woke agenda. I was like I heard the term woke agenda, was just like, "What are you talking about? This is social justice," like, it was just, like, people at each other. I'm curious what like your circles are like as somebody who's been doing this podcast now for 4 or 5 years, and as you say you've been seeing some good examples in classrooms. Like, it's one thing to talk abstractly about civil discourse, because I was talking abstractly about it myself, and then when I realized when it really came down to it, like, I was like a shrieking banshee with somebody who I really cared about. So yeah, looking for tips here, I suppose.
Oh, I got a bunch of tips. This is great. So, one thing we recently did an episode on framing, on political framing, and it's the thing that it's like the only thing I'm thinking about. And for anyone out there who's not familiar with the concept, I'm sure you both are. The reason I did the episode is somebody skied it on Blue Sky. If you're against all of the things in the quote unquote big, beautiful bill that has been put forward, sort of, not by the president, but through Congress at the whim of the president, stop calling it the big, beautiful bill. And what I saw at night is, people who were quite against the policies within it would say Trump's so-called big beautiful bill, and they would do the air quotes and they would be snide and sarcastic about it. However, they had already entered the president's framing. We keep hearing big beautiful bill, big beautiful, big beautiful bill. We're going to think it's a big bill. It's maybe not the most beautiful, but it's a little bit beautiful. The framing is more powerful than anything. And in your example, Emma, you've got social justice versus woke agenda. These are two frames, and no amount of facts, no like statistics that you bring up on the wall and photographs, you will never, ever be able with facts to break somebody out of their frame. It's nearly impossible. This is, I've been reading the books of, George Lakoff and the words of Frank Luntz, these notions of once a thing has been decided, once we start calling something, for example, a partial birth abortion, which is a non-existent term in the medical community, once we start using the shift from global warming to climate change, these words that we use to define problems, and again, social justice versus woke agenda, you can't get out of them. So how do you get out of them? There's a phenomenal guy named Ben Klutzy who works at George Mason University, he's sort of like working in a pluralist or pluralism institute. He says, to have a conversation with somebody with whom you disagree, it will not be possible unless three steps are met. Three adamantine rules. These are like
Ooh,
ironclad.
adamantine. Wow.
Adamantine. Is that even a real element, or is that just an X-Men element?
I'm not sure, but it's a good word regardless.
It is inexcusable and adamantine. But here's the three adamantine rules. Number one, it has to be done with respect at the outset. You cannot say something that disrespects him, and he cannot say something that disrespects you. You have to talk to each other with respect. And if you screw up, you have to say, sorry, 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 sorry. That's like the base foundation. Number two is honesty. Honesty is you have to say the real reason you're feeling something. I think a lot about my father, who was very against same sex marriage in the 1980s and 1990s. And he would have all these sort of willowy side reasons why he was against it. It was about taxes, and it was about, well, I could marry my best friend and get a tax break. And I'm like, Dad, what's your real problem, Dad? And it was not about the taxes. You have to be honest about why you feel that way. And step number three, adamantine rule number three, is curiosity. You actually have to be curious. Why do you think this way? How does it affect you? And if you have those three things met, you're going to be able to talk to each other. Another one is don't try to change somebody's mind. I've heard that, but I can't help myself, Emma. I try to do it all the time. I love trying to change people's mind, but I'm willing to have my own changed. So that's a good tip for anybody who's trying to have a civil conversation with somebody with whom they disagree. And then the last thing is hyperlocal, right? I can't have an argument with somebody about immigration law in the United States, right? But I might be able to talk about funding for, the paving on my street in Concord. I can talk about that, and we can have a good conversation about that. And then eventually we can get to much bigger things. The truth is, we forget that we are completely far more affected by the things that affect us on a hyper local level than on the national level. Though I will argue of the last 6 to 8 months, that's changed a tiny bit. But I still advocate caring about what's going on locally. You're going to be able to have much better conversations and you're going to get a lot more stuff done.
So you work with teachers and with students, right? And
Yeah, we do. Our show is designed secretly, not so secretly, to be used in classrooms from 8th to 12th grade across the United States. The vast majority of our listenership is people, from the ages of 30 to 60. So, teachers are playing our show in the classroom, but most people who listen to our show listen because they want to know how some piece of our government operates. Like, what is the difference between the House and the Senate? What is a shadow docket decision? We're doing one right now on what are the grievances in the Declaration of Independence? How does the Supreme Court pick cases to hear? All these very small things, one at a time. And if you listen to all 400, you'll have an understanding of how the system actually works. But yeah, we work with teachers a lot.
one of the other challenges, of course, is local polarization. And what I mean by that is it's even harder now to be in a class where different sides are at least somewhat evenly divided or represented. So, like if you're in a high school in Concord, Mass, you might get a handful of real staunch MAGA or just conservatives for at large, but you're not going to have like a lot of diversity even in a public high school. So you'll have some, and there's a little more, even in the most red or blue parts of the United States. 20% of people vote for the other side. Like, even in Alabama, there's some Democrats and I mean some more liberal Democrats, and there are definitely in the Northeast some genuine conservatives. So I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but it usually will feel, I think, in a school context where the deck is somewhat stacked against you socially. I don't know how you offset that part, right? Like nobody really wants it's a rare person who enjoys tilting against the group.
I will just push back on that, Zachary. My whole life has been as the tilter at the many windmills that we see in the world. I went to a really conservative boarding school for high school, in which there were 600 kids in the graduating class, and the members of the Young Republican Party, there were about 200, and the members of the Young Democratic Party were five people. So you're gonna have that anywhere you go in life. I mean, there's a reason we have these bubbles that ensconce us all the time. And yeah, the deck is going to be stacked against you, whichever side you're on. If you're rabid MAGA conservative and you're in a liberal classroom, you're going to have a tough time and you're going to put your armor on and you're going to come out fighting in a way maybe differently than you talk to a friend. I will say to your point though, Zachary, the polarization, and this is not new. We have been on a ramp up incline in polarization basically since the contract for America in the 1990s. After that, it has increased and increased and increased and increased. And at the same time, we are in a sea of information and a sea of mis and disinformation and propaganda. We have more information than we could ever consume. What do we do with that? We use anything we can to fight if we are the person who's tilting against the crowd. I think if I have many friends who believe differently politically than me. Emma, very similar situation in my life to what you went through, but there there's always a way to talk to somebody if you appeal to something outside of a party line, if you don't quote stats that you've read, if you don't have pre-designed arguments of how to choose somebody up, if you just talk to somebody and say, "How are you?" One exercise I heard the other day was somebody was talking to somebody else about Thanksgiving was coming up, right? Oh, and my uncle he's gonna give me a raft this Thanksgiving because he's mad about this. How do I talk to my uncle? And the advice was start by asking your uncle, like, what are, some real wonderful things he's done for his community lately, or people who need support locally for him that he's helped out, or he has friends who helped out. And you'll hear stories about people that he cares about and things in his community that, really good things. And once you're able to talk to somebody about things that are not the hot button political issues, about your community and who you care about, because that's what civics is. The word civic, civos, comes from citizen as well. Citizen just means a person in the town. That's all it means. A person in a community. That's where we get the word civics. If you care about your town and your community and your neighbor and you can talk to them, eventually you can get to the things that matter politically.
I also think that we can just choose not to talk about politics at all, right?
I don't know
Like,
if you want to do that though. Would you want to
well,
do that?
I mean, let me say that like strategically with some people, like
Yeah.
I think that when we're sometimes when we talk about conversations about how to have conversations, we kind of imagine like this person all the way over on the left or this person all the way over on the right, and I need to talk to like the hardest person there is to talk to. Where it's really just like you might just need to talk to like someone who's like one step from you on the right or one step from you on the left. And, like, that's a much easier conversation than being like, "Let me just, like, jump right over to, like, my most difficult uncle at Thanksgiving." Like,
Yeah.
I'm not saying don't talk at all, I'm just saying, like, maybe you don't need to talk to the guy who thinks that Hillary Clinton is a lizard in a human suit.
That's a fair point. I always love talking to the people who think Hillary Clinton is a lizard in a
Yeah,
human
well,
suit.
there's that, yeah.
Because what are those David Icke's books? Yeah, Fingerprints, like all those weird books about the lizard people. But I think you're right. There's a big argument these days that we all, capital we the people, have a lot more in common than we have differently. And one of the terms I heard used is conflict entrepreneurs are out there who are trying to breed and make money and get power from that conflict. Division actors and conflict entrepreneurs. And that's true. There are media organizations and there are politicians who are just racking up the power and the dollar bills by stoking those fires, by having woke agenda versus social justice arguments, right? But there's so much that makes up a person politically, and this is evidenced by the media, and I mean far left media, central media, and far right media's inability to make sense of the atrocious assassination of Charlie Kirk that happened recently. Everybody's trying to take this person and this horrible action and to put it into some sort of frame and some sort of nutshell, and an absolute inability to do so because the truth is there is no one hard line. We contain multitudes, but we really do. So yeah, somebody can agree with you on immigration policy and completely disagree with you on a woman's right to choose. And it's baffling, but that's what we are. That's what I hope we eventually return to as a nation. That's kind of how we started, which is somebody can disagree with you about representation in the states and the Senate and versus the House, and then somebody can really disagree with you on, slavery, and you can have these arguments about what we are and what we should be, and it's okay as long as you sort of maintain that way of talking to that other person non-violently.
You've talked a lot about the role of fun or making things more fun.
Have I? Have I been talking about fun?
Not in this conversation, no.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
But you are fun.
Oh, thank you, Emma.
in some of your other podcasts and work. No, we haven't been talking about that right now, but we're about to. Making education, as it were, not boring, but therefore more fun, right? Something that engages people. How do you respond to I guess the pushback is these things are too serious to be fun. Just like when people push back saying this is of too much gravitas to be humorous, right? Humor has a place, but not here. Fun has a place, but not here. But of course, one of the things that engages people educationally, right, is this idea that it's enjoyable, right? That it's a process that would have engaged the teenage Emma and not put her off.
Okay, now I feel like I'm getting flagellated here.
Yeah, it's
No,
re
you're getting used as exhibit A. There's a
Ugh.
difference.
Fine, fine.
And a rather apropos exhibit A. I mean, meaning like
No.
I think you are massively representative rather than, you know, out of the box. I mean, you're out of the box in other ways. I'm just talking about this way.
so to the fun question. Let's have a serious talk about the fun.
Let's really be
We're gonna
serious.
put that fun in a little box. And we're gonna talk about it. So when the show Civics 101 was started in 2017, it was what's called a two-way in the radio world, which is just another word for an interview. I don't know, we don't just say interview. And my initial job was try to sort of push that towards high school students in the country to make the show approachable to them. And that it wasn't really working because it just a straight up interview about civics concepts was not really digestible or fun. But then sort of the show shifted. The host, she was fantastic. She moved to another broadcasting company. Hannah, my co-host, and I, deep friends, we decided to make the show a bit more fun and to use music and sound effects and jokes and talk to each other like human beings and tell sort of a narrative story about how we learned about this one concept. That's what each episode is. There are some things that are not fun. If we're doing an episode about, Dred Scott v. Sanford or Plessy v. Ferguson, I'm not going to have jokes in there. I will have sound effects and I will have music. But what we do in the show, if we're talking about something serious, we will address it seriously. But then to have the fun, we'll talk about a related concept, an earlier Supreme Court case, an earlier law that was passed in America, and that has parallels to this much more serious thing. And once you understand that, you can understand the serious thing. Another thing is we talk about systems and processes. We don't talk about politics on our show. We just talk about this means this means this means this means this. And that's how it happens. And that can always be fun. That can always have ragtime piano music in the background. Hannah always calls it, Nick, is this another the price of milk episode? And I'm like, yep, this is another one of those. Me rattling off fun stories about the price of milk from, 1863 all the way to now. But I think there's always a space for fun. And in terms of engagement, I love Emma, Zachary. I love what I do more than anything I've done in my entire life. I adore working for this show. I am nowhere in the same grade as these high school teachers in the United States. Civics teachers across the country, high school teachers, social studies teachers, there is no better group at getting students engaged. They know better than anybody, how to make a lesson engaging. All we can offer to them is an extra voice or an extra way to listen to understand a civics concept. And I am perpetually in awe of their work. So it's happening. It's happening out there.
I think you could have done a fun thing with Plessy versus Ferguson. Like, imagine you're a Supreme Court justice in 1896 and you're trying to come up with a catchphrase that eventually is separate but equal. Come up with different ones, like different but the same.
Same,
You
same,
could do
but
like a
different.
whole list
Same,
before you
same,
get
but
to that.
different. Yeah, one of these things is not like the other. You know what's interesting? Actually, if just as a side little civics note about that one, we had a guest on for our Plessy versus Ferguson episode who said he has a search, a Google search alert when everybody says Plessy v. Ferguson enshrined the concept of separate but equal and made it the law of the land. And that is just like how we started today, Zachary. This is the Supreme Court made separate but equal the law of the land. Does the Supreme Court make laws? No, it certainly does not. Did it enshrine separate but equal? No. States, dozens of states practiced, had separation laws on the books at that time. Small congresses and states were the ones who enshrined the law of separate but equal. The Supreme Court just upheld that law and then, overturned it in Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. But it's like we've been doing this since the beginning. Is like we sort of give the power and we give the blame to the wrong people sometimes. We did a whole series of Supreme Court decisions that were civil rights decisions. And for each one, when we could, we interviewed a direct descendant of the named party in the case. So, one of the descendants of, in Dred Scott, I talked to descendants of Plessy and Ferguson who live in New Orleans, and Korematsu. Oh, and I even got to talk to Jim Obergefell himself in Obergefell v. Hodges. It's important to talk to the people who are the parties in these cases.
What did the Plessy versus Ferguson descendants have to say?
They were wonderful. They actually got together and started a foundation called Plessy and Ferguson in New
Oh
Orleans.
my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's the two of them. It's Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson. And they teach students across the country, how did this happen? Plessy v. Ferguson is like such a fascinating case, such a fascinating story.
There's something like this in Charlottesville, I think, with the descendants of Sally Hemings and the descendants of Jefferson. There's like a Jefferson Hemings society.
I think that's important. The Supreme Court Historical Society, I should say, not the Supreme Court, is doing some really cool projects called hometowns, where students from across the country go to the town that was the center of a Supreme Court ruling, and they see where the thing happened that was argued about in the court. And they learn about it with law professors and judges and lawyers for like 3 weeks. And these high school students, after 3 weeks, are at the level of constitutional scholars in this one case because they were there where it happened. That's so important.
See, these things we don't focus on, right? We try to focus on good stories, good news, things that are going on in the world at the Progress Network that just fly beneath the radar, right? Because they're not dramatic. They're usually more, there's more Concord, not your Concord, Massachusetts, actual Concord, and not the grapes either, just so we're all clear. Because that doesn't usually constitute news and stories. And if it does, it's allowed, it's footnote. We've joked for years that you always got the last segment of the local news was the firemen saving, cats in trees kind of thing. And
The
because everything
postman's
else
whistle.
was just,
Yeah.
murder and collapse and corruption. And stories like the one you just told of the Supreme Court Historical Society doing this, which require a lot of effort and time and a lot of buy-in from a lot of different groups, it doesn't resonate as a news story, right?
Hmm.
A news story would be on one of those trips, one of the professors said something that a student got offended by and he got suspended. Right? That
Right.
that would be the news story. The news story would not be the 72 other times where everybody emerged from that experience like, "Wow, that was great. My life is enriched. My horizons were opened." Isn't that I mean, wow.
Yeah, my school had a great debate about the Second Amendment, and kids came and they agreed and they disagreed, and they all agreed to disagree and disagreed to agree. That story doesn't come out in the newspaper. And if it did come out anywhere, it'd be the local newspaper, which is a dying institution. We are all hyper focused on what is the big gruesome thing that happened today.
There is a human nature to that, right? Like nobody writes a story saying, 12,000 planes took off and landed safely this week. Talk to your local air traffic controller going, "Yeah, things were fine."
And yet another political assassination that happened a while ago, and sorry to bring it so gruesome again, but I would see people I spend all my time on, left-leaning articles, right-leaning articles. I listen to well, there's not much left-wing radio, but I listen to what I can, and far-right conservative radio. I listen to all of it, 'cause that's what I have to do for my job. And there was this thing was, this assassination happened in a state that had red flag laws. So therefore, these red flag laws are useless. And that's the same thing, which is you don't read a news story about a red flag law that prevented somebody being shot. That's just it doesn't happen. That wouldn't be news. We don't talk about the things that are wholesome, good, and fun and interesting unless we're a local newspaper. But the good stuff's out there, and specifically in civics and social studies classrooms.
To circle back to our beginning as we end, that too is not news. My example at the beginning of the student misunderstanding the constitutional structure of the United States for presumably lack of prior education is a story.
Yeah,
Everybody getting it right in a debate about these things isn't.
that's right. Well, that's a problem. But the bigger problem is how do we get people to be interested in the sort of quotidian successes of our everyday civic lives? That's what you're all trying to do, I suppose.
Well, on that one, I would encourage everyone to tune in to Nick's podcast.
So yeah, the show is called Civics 101. You can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your audio. And the book that Hannah and I wrote about these systems is called A User's Guide to Democracy: How America Works. And you can get that wherever you get your books.
As we say, everything is now everywhere, so you can get all these things anywhere,
All at
which
once. That's right.
all at once, audio, visual, you name it, whatever medium works for you, spiritual included. Anyway, Nick, I want to thank you for your work and your time today. It's God's work, yeoman's work, layman's work, anybody's work, but it's work that needs to be done. And the fact that it's being done more informally. So you talked at one point about cutting of government funding, which is a problem. But some of those informal spaces, some of those formal spaces are then filled by informal action. And I would include your podcast and this one as well as informal action, but real action that fills some of the place, not sufficiently maybe. And that too, I think, is an indication of kind of a much more robust civic society de facto in the United States than the observable one de jure. And we'll use Emma again as the example 101. The fact
You're
that you
killing me.
have lived no, but I mean the fact that you've lived the life that you've lived, I think is also indicative of yes, it's true you didn't do that, but you kind of did it anyway.
Yeah,
And
true.
while I do think you're unusual, I don't think you're like one in a million unusual. I mean, yes, you're absolutely unique and you're one in a billion
I
unusual. But
contain multitudes. Nick just
Yeah,
told us that.
multitudes. Emma is one and one, the greatest number
but
of
I think
all.
there are a lot of people who, as you said, who gravitate toward all this anyway. Who listen to your podcast who didn't have that, who seek this stuff out. And we should probably celebrate that a little bit more too.
I appreciate that, and I do have a Parthian shot in that direction, Zachary, which is of all of the things that I have talked about, all the political issues over the last 6 years, there is truly only one that is for real bipartisan, where the right and the left feel exactly as strongly about it, and it is civics education. You go to any of these conferences. We were in DC yesterday for Constitution Day. Huge institutions. And these are institutions that you would think are far right-leaning institutions pouring money, investment, and ideas and devotion into supporting civics education and to having civil discourse and to reducing polarization. It's there. The money is starting to be there. It's not federal money anymore for Civics 101 after the rescissions, but it's happening. So celebrate that. Everybody wants this on both sides.
Thank you, Nick.
Great ending.
Oh, thank you.
It's striking how much we have, almost without purposely doing it, ended up focusing on a series of themes this season, and one of which, sort of civics, the role of the court. We touched on that a little bit in the episode, but it's clearly kind of in the air, right? It's something that it feels palpable as people around the country are grappling with what is the nature of our constitutional system? What is the nature of our government and the relationship between government and the citizenry? And like that's a much larger thing that's being grappled with than the immediacy of the sort of partisan argument. Because I think it there's a lot of people grappling with this. It's not just left responding negatively to Trump or the right triumphantly, celebrating it. I think there's a lot of back and forth here about the system that is engendering people to actually look at, well, what is the nature of our system? And I see that happening more rather than the more extreme examples, which, yeah, I kicked off the show with because it's an example of where things are still lacking.
Yeah, I feel like the rejoinder to that is like this discussion is happening precisely because of the threats. I don't know, maybe you can explain to me like where you see the kind of like larger conversation beyond the fact that there's a lot of executive overreach going on right now. Cuz that seems to me like that's what's bringing all this up.
I do think there was a legitimacy to some of the right's reactiveness of under both Biden and Obama and creepingly over the 20th century, there was a lot of executive overreach. I mean, the irony, of course, is executive overreach that is objectionable to one side is being countered by executive overreach on the other side. So it's not as if anybody is currently saying the solution to these problems is less executive overreach. It's more like my executive overreach will override your executive overreach. But the whole question of like, what is the power of the executive? And the court is indeed sort of grappling with this. It's, you know, we will see how this evolves, but there's an emerging legal doctrine about what the nature of executive authority is, which is a change from the 20th century, but it's not purely the president has more power, right? Because there's a huge aspect of the court that's actually trying to limit the powers of the administrative state, even if it increases the power of the president over the executive branch. The rights had its own debate dynamic around this for decades about the creeping powers of the presidency. And again, I'm admitting the irony of some of the ways the creeping powers of the presidency seem to be being solved by the right are to not only creep the powers of the presidency, but step on the accelerator. But the debate remains very alive and very lively.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, there's certainly I think that's a fair characterization. There's quite a few things that, going back a couple of decades or more, and we've certainly stepped on the accelerator now. I think that's a fair characterization. I was kind of hoping that some of this is going to get us back to, and I'm thinking a little bit about a piece by Gary Kasparov, the chess master, if anyone's unfamiliar with him, saying like the only thing that is going to work right now, and this was in response to Charlie Kirk actually, is like a return to like a values backed debate, values backed debate over free speech, a values backed debate over executive overreach and the power of the government. This goes into arguments around the filibuster, going beyond the partisanship might be a very Pollyannish hope for where we could go from here, but this is the show to make that argument, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think there's more of it going on every day because I don't remember having this level of intense public, often angry debate over what's the nature of the government. I mean, there's a lot of debate over what policy should we do. Our debates now are far more about the government framework. I mean, they are over policies as well, but it's interesting that we've spent a lot of time this year, both on the show and I think collectively as a country, debating what's the nature of government.
I think that's very true. And I have seen, I think the online discourse after Charlie Kirk was killed has been exhausting. But I did also see some really wonderful videos that's like, guys, like you were the whole point of avoiding political violence and the whole point of living in a liberal system is I have my rights and you have your rights and my rights don't infringe on you practicing your rights and like let's get back to that, right? So that conversation does exist and it is out there even if it's not the thing that seems like it's the thing floating around right now.
So, on that note, as we begin to wind down our season, we have a couple more episodes. We want to thank you for listening. If you've been consistent listeners throughout 2025, we will take a bit of a pause at the end of the year and be back with you in 2026. But we want to thank you for your time and energy and effort. We do not take your time lightly, given that the one thing we all have a finite amount of individually is time. So the fact that you have chosen to spend it with us, we are honored by and thankful for. I want to thank the Podglomerate for producing, the team at the Progress Network for supporting, Emma for co hosting, and all of you for listening. Please sign up for our weekly newsletter, What Could Go Right, which you can find at theprogressnetwork.org. And we will be with you soon.